So we start off from this proposition. As you know, there was an originalist position. I'll call it originalist, although I think there was a checkered discussion even then. And this is the originalist, libertarian perspective on how the internet should or could be regulated. And the idea was, you won't be welcome amongst us, you have no sovereignty where we gather. It should be said this was a much smarter statement than it looks now, 17 years later, out of context. John Perry Barlow made this declaration of the independence of cyberspace. It was about the Rushlakon conference of that year, the gathering of heads of government and corporations. It was in response to the Communications Decency Act of 1996, which is part of what was called the Telecommunications Deregulation Act of 1996. The joke is in the middle word of that, the Deregulation Act of 1996. And of course, what he was saying was partly a local discussion about the need to strike down the parts of the Communications Decency Act which were found to be unconstitutional in the landmark case of Reno and American Civil Liberties Union, which was the following year. So there's two basic claims here, aren't there? The first claim is government shouldn't be involved in regulating the internet. The second, which is the weaker claim, is that they can't be involved. And I think we can sort of dismiss the second, that they can't be involved, because for good or bad or indifferent, government can, of course, be involved in all kinds of ways. And I'm conscious in the audience we've got people with all kinds of specialisations on the internet, all of which have greater or lesser extents of government involvement. So here's our baseline, and this will be, to this audience, will be very obvious. Internet use is ubiquitous. Governments, legislators, regulatory agencies and others all falling further and further behind in actual fact in terms of their technical knowledge, but also their ability to regulate effectively. They can still regulate. I mean, the Iranian government can say we will have a halal internet. They can disconnect Iran from the rest of the world's internet to some extent, albeit that there's still ways of connecting. Is that actually a sensible policy just because you can pass a law of that kind? Almost certainly not. So the analysis we have is a critical analysis of the shaping by regulation of what we're calling code in the broad sense. We can talk about definitions later. We're using this really in the Lessig sense of the hardware and software that drives the internet. So this is really a broad use of that term to refer to the use of law to regulate technology. So that's what we're actually examining. This is not the first time it's been done. Lessig famously talked about code as law. He talked about the way in which code can shape laws on the internet, but also that laws can shape code on the internet, that there's a relationship, there's a symbiosis between laws and the code, the software code, the hardware that drives the internet. But coders, of course, also operate within a normative framework. And it's nonsense to suggest that the people who designed the internet didn't think about the principles that they were designing when they were putting the internet together. Often this discussion may have been more subliminal than necessarily open, but nevertheless, people were not doing these things in a vacuum. They knew what they were doing. What we think we can achieve, and this is our grand claim, is that it is possible to have more both economically efficient, in other words, competitive but also open to innovation, and socially just regulation, which means addressing fundamental rights in a way which is more effective than has been done up to now. So that's the claim that we make at the outset of the book. And we take a critical approach both in terms of the technologies and the way technologies affect society, but also in terms of the law and the way that law is written. So in other words, we're not just saying, this is obviously very, 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 very far from a black letter approach, but we look at things, we look at the law the way it's enforced. So you'll see later on we have a rather startling conclusion that the United States federal regulators are doing a better job of enforcing privacy in social networking than the European regulators are. And so we look very much at the implementation of law as well as the shape of law in itself. Quick word about some of the literature, and I'm going to focus here on the legal literature, although obviously we have a very broad span of literature that we examine at the outset of the book. Everyone knows Tim Wu's work, I'm sure. Everyone will know Yochai Benkler's work. Lawrence Lessig we've talked about. Jonathan Zittrain. Barbara Van Schevick, who's written a lot about net neutrality. In general, and there's one exception there that I'll talk about, there has been a skepticism of the role of government, particularly the federal government in the US, in helping to right the wrongs that are seen on the internet by these analysts. And of course, bear in mind, we're very much sort of standing on the shoulders of giants when it comes to our analysis. The one exception in that group is Tim Wu, who says in his book, The Master Switch, that there should be a separations principle. that actually internet companies should not be allowed to vertically integrate between, for instance, internet service provider functions and content functions. So he's much more radical than we are in terms of government intervention. And I think Tim's around this parish a little bit at this time of the year.
He's coming this weekend.
Oh, there we are. So, and in fact, we're at a conference with him. He just misses it. But we're going to see him in Strasbourg at the end of the month anyway for a discussion the Council of Europe's having about network neutrality and fundamental rights, which is very much in the theme that we're talking about. We are very, you might say cynical, or at least critical, of the idea that the super user can solve the problems. So at the outset of the book, we talk about the idea that somehow we could use encryption on an individual basis to ensure that we could all get outside the remit of government and therefore avoid problems caused by bad law imposed by government. Paul Ohm has talked about the myth of the super user, a wonderful paper written 4 years ago at the Telecom Policy Conference. And he says that you can't set policy assuming that everyone is supremely technologically literate. It doesn't work with a ubiquitous technology like the internet. You have to assume people are as idiotic using the internet as I am, and therefore not able to use the kind of technologies that would protect us from some of the bad laws that exist. So we like the more empirical view that's taken by people like Milton Mueller, Milton's book 3 years ago, which was called Networks and States, I think, which is actually in the same... Many of the books that we talk about are actually in the same book series at MIT Press, and that's just because it happens to be a very good book series, I think. Also, Laura Donardis, who's technology studies from the point of view of society, and they've done a lot of work that really looks at the institutional setting within which internet governance operates, and accepting the fact that history matters, and the way in which these institutions have been formed matters. And I think coming to this centre, I don't need to tell you that history matters and that the way in which these forms have arrived matters, because obviously that's very much to do with the approach that you've taken to intellectual property and other information laws. So that's just at the outset. So what we look at is prosumers, to use the European Commission jargon, not super users. We look at all of us, and we are all now prosumers. If we update a Facebook status or retweet anything or put anything on a website, we are actually producers as well as consumers. So prosumer is this ugly producer-consumer jargon which is used. And we are all now prosumers to one extent or another. And so we're aware that ever since the dawning of Web 2.0, to use the probably the correct pronunciation of it, and related tools with that, we have more active users, not simply passive consumers. We are not somehow an audience that's broadcast at. We're not simply surfing, we're actually producing as well. And so we say some of these arguments that have been made in the United States for self-regulation, for solutions that allow users to have bottom-up driven solutions, may work, and Ian came up with a nice expression, which is that the idea that we have solutions made by geeks, for geeks, controlled by geeks, works for geeks, which is great. But for the other 99%, we need to come up with a solution that will help them. And we think that European regulatory space is a much more fertile ground to explore the fact that state can actually play a positive role, in addition to all of the sins which American authors talk about the US federal government as displaying because of corporate capture, amongst other things. So typically the American copyright argument, for instance, is you can't trust American copyright law at the federal level because Hollywood and Disney are going to buy the legislators, and therefore you're going to get worse and worse and worse copyright laws going forward. We're not so cynical in the book. So it's an empirical investigation. There are 5 case studies, and there's one prior art, which is about encryption, anonymity, and what that might mean in terms of security. The 5 case studies, which I'll talk about on the next slide, based on multi-year investigations, various studies, some of them funded by the European Commission, some of them funded by EPSRC and others. And we've just listed them there, they're all in the book itself. What we want to do is to reassess the prior art in terms of how we regulate code based on what we're calling hard cases here. Now, I produced a book 2 years ago called Internet Co-Regulation, which was Cambridge University Press. And that talked about 21 case studies, in almost all of which there was a single self-regulatory solution, which we then analysed in terms of its suitability, its constitutional values, if any, and the way in which it responded to users. These are not such cases. All of these 5 cases don't have a regulator or a self-regulator in place. And that's because they are areas in which you have lack of consensus, to say the least, because you have diametrically opposed views on different sides of the debate. And so these are areas where there needs to be some kind of mediation, because without some kind of mediation, and that suggests a role for government, or a role at least for some kind of governance arrangement, you're simply going to provide the same clash of cultures, lack of solutions that will carry on going. And in all cases, there's a clash between market outcomes and protection of fundamental human rights. And we'll explore these as we go through. So the 5 case studies are data protection. You won't be surprised to learn that there are enforcement failures, what everyone thinks of the actual law itself. And we talk about code solutions, like privacy by design, whether one can come up with solutions that will work with the law and actually help the law to be more effective. We look at copyright. We look at, obviously, the capture of the law by lobbyists, you won't be surprised to learn. And we also look at the kind of code solutions which have outflanked the copyright lawyers, namely things like peer-to-peer distribution systems, the failure of digital rights management for the most part to impose further control over users. Filtering, and this is generally about government filtering, or at least government-induced filtering. So this is about the growth of censorship. What we see is a disappearing but nevertheless surprising degree of freedom that still existed on the internet in the last several years. And this is actually allied, so this is government-induced. So we have quite a large case study within the book of looking at WikiLeaks and attempts by various governments to prevent the distribution of materials via WikiLeaks. And not just, of course, by direct government action, but also by inducing companies like Amazon and PayPal and the Swiss Postal Bank and others to stop WikiLeaks being able to either distribute material or to be funded itself to continue its activities. We also look at social networks as a special case. You might sort of call this a special case of data protection, but it also has some interesting elements within it of child protection regulation and other things. There is dominance, you'll be not shocked to learn, in social networking. Certainly in the Latin alphabet world, it's very clear that dominance is from Facebook for the most part. We talk about the network effects that exist, the fact that competition law is not a very effective way of dealing with the dominance that exists. And we deal with what we call corporate social irresponsibility, which is what happens when you have a situation where the dominant network is able to essentially write its own rules of its relationship with users. And then finally we deal with what we call smart pipes, and this reprises the net neutrality argument that I've made earlier in various different places, but looks at the way in which internet service providers are attempting to introduce more quality of service, to provide better service for some categories of content, and the way in which they're deploying technology such as deep packet inspection to control the user's experience. And so this is, if you like, the corporate censorship or the corporate control argument. If you like, this is the second half of the filtering chapter. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker. But just to say that one of the things that we're very keen on talking about as a solution is the idea that mandated interoperability will provide us with at least the beginning of a set of tools that will enable prosumers to have more, to have their rights better respected by dominant platforms, because they will be able to interoperate with other platforms and therefore be able to reduce entry barriers or reduce exit barriers. We think that if we can introduce greater competition via interoperability, amongst other things, that we can enhance competitive protection of public goods. And of course, public goods, when it comes to the internet, include digital innovation. It includes public safety, however one might like to see that, and there are various different definitions of how of the different topics that are arrived at there. And of course, fundamental democratic rights, even the way these are in tension with each other. So of course, freedom of expression and privacy are very often in tension with each other. But both need to be respected. And so a key aspect of interoperability, which of course will include imposing FRAND terms, fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory access terms, is something that we talk about in several of the case studies. And in fact, we'll sort of carry that forward a bit, because there's some things that have happened recently where we think that we can talk about that. I think probably most people in this room are aware that Motorola Mobility has just been issued with a letter by the European Commission telling them that they can't be using essential standards patents on non-FRAND terms, for instance. Okay, so here's an example of the kind of things that we think are a worry in terms of competition without interoperability. And this is that you may be able to leave Facebook, but the way in which you leave Facebook is not going to provide you with an efficient alternative. So you may be able to delete all your data. You may be able to force Facebook to delete all your data. That will only cover the user's tracks, even if you think that Facebook can convince third parties to delete all your data as well. Because, of course, you can leave Facebook, but you're locked into Facebook not as an individual, but because you're part of a community which has formed an element of social capital on Facebook. This is something which leaves most competition lawyers rather befuddled. The idea that it's not about the individual's choice, but there's actually a group activity and a group dynamic, which might mean that you can't use traditional models to actually address the problem. And so we think that we need interconnection and interoperability, more than just transparency, which is what the debate has been dominated by up to now, and some theoretical possibility to switch, because the conditions have to be in place to allow that switching to take place more effectively. And that means not just porting your data, but being able to speak to your friends within Facebook if you're on another network. Because if you can't, all you're doing is abandoning your community. And the idea that abandoning your community is an effective means of addressing the problem, I think, is a very limited point of view. So it's interoperability to permit exit. And those lower entry and exit barriers should lead to increased consumer welfare, because it should make Facebook behave itself better. There were some shoulds on this slide. Okay, now Neelie Kroes is the commissioner for DG Connect, and she's actually been responsible, not just at DG Connect, but when she was also at DG Competition, for dealing with the European Interoperability Framework. This is the European Commission's policy and the Member States' policy towards introducing greater interoperability, not just within IT products themselves, but within the way in which they're used within the different Member States. And so she said that she wanted to fix the problem of having to run an epic antitrust case, an epic competition case, every time software lacks interoperability. Now, of course, she said this at the end of the beginning of the Microsoft case, before the major fines were being introduced in 2009. So the European Interoperability Framework is a response, by the way, to various other cases as well. Intel has been fined. Apple itself was forced to offer interoperability. Rambus, which is a chip maker, was also forced into a similar situation. We talk about Google. You're aware that Google is currently in negotiation with the European Commission over its proposed remedies in its own competition case. And we think perhaps in the future Facebook might face similar problems, which may be overcome by interoperability, whether as a voluntary commitment, which is what Google's so far offering, or as something which is more mandated. And so she announced this policy, and the policy has a bias in favour of interoperability in policy. And the concerns here are not just about competition solutions which introduced interoperability, but also the idea that you should be telling member states that they should be biasing their purchasing decisions in favour of interoperable software. Member states, if you tot up all of the activities of member states, the NHS, schools, universities, the police, local government, central government, purchases over 50% of all IT that's actually bought. So not only is it the largest purchaser, it's actually the majority purchaser. So if there was a bias in favour of interoperability across government procurement, that could go a very long way to tipping the market in favour of more interoperable solutions. And this is what the European Interoperability Framework is trying to achieve. For those of you who are real Brussels policy wonks, this is Action 26 on the Digital Action Plan. It is partially achieved. So this is the last slide I'm going to talk about. Mandated choice. Microsoft, as you know, was actually after the end of Neelie Kroes' epic competition case. It was then fined because Windows, was it Internet Explorer 9 in Windows 7? Didn't have the choice of browser that was mandated at the end of the case that the Commission brought against them. And this went on for about 18 months. Google and others notified the Commission that this was taking place, trying to be friendly and helpful. And for this error, which is what Microsoft insisted it was, they were fined €561 million. An expensive line of code. And of course it was, to some extent, a code-based solution that the European Commission was asking them to achieve, to give people a choice. Let me give you an example of an older technology. Sky, as most people know, is the satellite provider in this country. The Sky Electronic Program Guide, which is this thing here, carries terrestrial channels, BBC, ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, on channels 101 to 105. That's not because Mr. Murdoch wants to do that. It's because there is a regulation in place, and it goes in the European Commission's directive. It then carries through into Ofcom's responsibilities under the Communications Act of 2003, and then into a code of practice on APGs. As a result of that, Sky 1, Mr. Murdoch's first channel, is channel 106. I'll set you a test. Try to find, when you go home this evening, if you are a Sky subscriber, if you are locked into that platform, try and find channel 4 HD and see what number that is, because that doesn't fall under what I call these must carry and due prominence requirements. Now, we're not, of course, saying that we should be regulating the internet as if it's a television EPG, but what we are saying is we can learn lessons from earlier communications networks about how to deal with dominant players to try to achieve things like greater interoperability and to mandate greater choice. I'll hand over to Ian.
So let me give you some more examples of very recent cases where I think the principles that Chris has been describing, we draw out in the book, give some ideas on how we might achieve this better regulation. So first of all, do not track. I'm sure the computer scientists are aware of, the lawyers may not have seen, but this is a standard that the World Wide Web Consortium has been developing that would allow all internet users through their web browser to set a preference saying, I don't want, as I browse around the internet, to be tracked, because many companies are doing this, building up profiles of people and then showing them targeted adverts based on that profiling. So there's been a lot of calls for top-down regulation just to completely ban this practice, and some of the European countries that, like Germany, that are much more in favour of heavy state intervention would like that state solution. What the WTC has tried to achieve instead, through this, all of the sort of good things, buzzwords on good governance that Chris already mentioned, multi-stakeholder, so bringing together not just the advertising industry and the browser manufacturers, but also the privacy regulators, the privacy advocates, holding open meetings. The standards body, I think, does a lot of its business in open email lists, as standards, others internet standards bodies like the IETF do. And what they've been trying to achieve around this table is, can we come up with a standard that will keep the advertising industry happy enough so they will respect this do not track signal if people have put it in place in their browsers, but it still gives them the opportunity to profile people's interests and show targeted adverts if people have not specifically objected to that. This is a really fascinating case study in itself for, what are the things that make these processes work, in some cases not work in others. In this case, as you can see, this quote is just from a few days ago. In fact, this process is breaking down now. It's been going over the last couple of years. The graph at the top is from Mozilla, who make Firefox. They are gathering statistics on how many Firefox users have set this do not track option in Firefox. So you can see it's gradually going up there, but it still hasn't, where are they? So by March 2013, they'd only got up towards 12%, so still not anywhere close to a majority of users. Some other browser manufacturers, Microsoft in particular, have gone much further than that. So Microsoft actually in this case have gone down the mandated choice route. When people set up Windows for the first time on a new computer, it will ask them, would you like do not track enabled in Internet Explorer? And actually most people then will say no. And that is where the advertising industry has become very resistant to this approach, because they don't mind so much the 11 or 12% of people setting the option consciously and specifically in the browser. They really don't want it to be a mandated choice, or even worse, a default, something that is set and it's up to the user then to unset it. I'm sure you've heard the advertising industry say, but people like targeted adverts. People like to see adverts that are relevant to their interests. I've not seen any empirical evidence of that, but certainly people don't like the idea of being followed around the internet and profiles built up of them by companies that they've never heard of, so that these profiles can be used to show them adverts. There is empirical data on that from the University of California, Berkeley. I think the problem with do not track has been there has not been specific enough consequences promised by government regulators. So one of the things we say in the book is, if you're going to have these kind of co-regulatory solutions, it's not pure self-regulation where you just leave everything to industry, because often their industry will just do what is beneficial to industry, which is unsurprising. You need to have credible, specific promises/threats of action by governments to say, if you can't reach agreement in fora like these, government will take specific actions. Although the FTC and the European Commission have made vague threats that they will take action if the do not track process doesn't work, we think it demonstrates this idea that it has to be, you have to go further than that. I won't say much more about this, but in the book we talk about a similar process that did work on RFID tags, where the European Commission went through a similar process, set up a multi-stakeholder dialogue. Actually, that was first pass similarly captured by industry, but the critical difference there was the code that the multi-stakeholder group produced had to be approved by the data protection authorities of the EU member states. And so they said, no, you have to try again, and that put enough pressure on this multi-stakeholder group in that case to then come back with a much better, more effective, protective code on RFID that still had the benefits of having industry expertise and industry buy-in through the multi-stakeholder group. It wasn't just the European Commission writing very detailed laws and technical standards that might not have been effective, might have been overly bureaucratic. So it's very interesting looking at how those different cases are working. Secondly, the Google competition cases, Chris already mentioned. So the screenshots on the right-hand side there, it's very interesting here, sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of, well, how exactly can the competition type approach that we talk about work even at the user interface level. So these are mock-ups that Google have created for the European Commission as ideas for how Google might voluntarily meet the concerns of the Commission rather than the Commission having to then impose remedies on them. So you can see that, you probably can't see very well, but Google Shopping, they would allow competitor sites to say, well, you can go shopping on site 1, site 2, site 3. So you at least give that option. I should say, by the way, as Grimmelman said, that the FTC and, I think similarly, the European approach has been very favourable to Google, so this might not go nearly far enough. But just as examples of what Google have proposed, some competition code, putting the competitors on their homepage at least, so in different places, on maps. Down here you can see labelling, because as you know, if you use Google, what they will very often do with a lot of types of data now, including news, including maps, including shopping, they have their own specialised search engines within the overall broad search engine, and they'll show you their results first. There are other competitor specialised search engines, and it's them that have been mostly making the complaints to the Commission and driving this competition remedy. The FTC agreement with Google actually, Grimmelman is not exaggerating, it sort of says, well, but this is all a wonderful thing, consumers love this. And I'm sure that's true to a large extent, that yes, it is incredibly handy when you search for cameras that Google will immediately show you that, or pop up the maps, or show you the weather, or show you the flights, or all the other areas of specialised data that Google is now building into their service. But it sets up a very high barrier to competitors if you don't have at least these kind of options in place, or go further. I think that's something that will be really we would like to explore more. How would we apply some of the remedies we've developed in the book in the Google case? Because we avoided we avoided search engines as a hard case in the book because so much was happening, and has indeed happened since the book was published. Another example, but very interesting speech given just a month ago by the chief executive of the UK and Ireland Booksellers Association at the London Book Fair. So you can see there, booksellers getting quite concerned about the dominance of Amazon, not just as a bookseller, but now, as you know, Amazon is signing up authors, acting as a publisher, acting as an agent. Of course, Kindle has been incredibly successful as an ebook reader. So those, if you want to know what dominance looks like, forget Facebook. Look at Kindle there. Amazing statistics. 92% of the 1.3 million e-readers sold in the UK before last Christmas were Kindles. Of course, that gives Amazon great market power, not just in selling ebooks, but also from knowing what its customers are buying. Of course, Kindle ebooks can pass back very detailed data to the mothership, to Amazon, about exactly what customers are doing. You know, it doesn't just know that you've bought an ebook, it knows every time you opened it, have you got to the end, what are you highlighting and writing in notes, so on. So that gives Amazon a lot of information about their customers, even beyond what they have just as an online retail store that other booksellers don't have. And actually, funnily enough, although I think the chief executive of the Booksellers Association probably wouldn't like what we have to say about copyright in general, he's thinking along very similar lines to us in terms of, well, what might a competition response look like linking to interoperability. So you could see you don't have to read right through all these quotes, but the final quote there, you can see he focuses on this new ebook standard the International Publishers Association has put forward, and they're saying that all ebook retailers, including Amazon, should support this, so customers have meaningful choice. So customers can buy the e-reader that best suits their own preferences. They can buy ebooks then from any store that suits their preference. If they want to change e-reader, they're not locked in. They can take the books with them. And these are all things that are essential for competition to be effective. And we argue in the book it would be really worth competition regulators looking much more carefully at these. And the interesting way that links into the broader debate about copyright and digital rights management, the thing that caused basically DRM to die in the music market was ironically that because the iTunes Music Store had been so successful as the first sort of very large-scale music reader, did have DRM on the music the first couple of years, you probably remember. Apple were then put in a position of enormous market power with facing the the recording industry, music sellers, and were able to force certain agreements on them, such as the pricing of the tracks, which the music industry was actually very unhappy about. And I think hopefully the book publishers, so ironically, Apple then used that market power to require digital rights management to be removed from the MP3 files that they were selling. I think the book industry have learned that lesson, that it actually, one risk with anti-interoperability technologies like digital rights management is you risk creating new monopolists or new gateways that then will rebound on you as a seller. You thought you were protecting your revenue stream through putting DRM on your files, but actually you were sort of re-intermediating, and you were giving Apple or Amazon suddenly a great deal of power in the market that may be used against your interests. And one of the largest science fiction publishers, Tor, has been experimenting over the last year. They publish, I think, Cory Doctorow, if you read Boing Boing, and a number of other well-known science fiction authors. What they found is with DRM-free books, actually, which they've been releasing for the last year, they haven't found any impact on levels of copyright infringement online. So I think that is a very positive thing for the publishing industry to have learned from the music industry experience. We talk a lot more in the book about how digital rights management and three strikes solutions, the idea that internet service providers should be policing their users for copyright infringement, should be taking actions against them like throttling their bandwidth or ultimately disconnecting them if there are multiple reports of copyright infringement made against users. Why we don't think those are effective regulation either, but we might like to discuss those in the questions. So I'll try to wrap up just the last couple of slides. So one of the broader issues one of the broader themes we have right through the book is, can we, as Chris said right at the start, achieve economically effective and socially just regulation? Can we take into account innovation? Can we encourage innovation whilst at the same time protecting privacy, freedom of expression, these other fundamental democratic values? And you tend to see, even in the scholarship in internet regulation, a focus often on one or the other. And we make a plea, really, that we think you can integrate the two, and actually the outcome of integrating the two will be much more effective and better for society as well as for the individual markets that you're trying to regulate. And if any of you have sort of pricked up your ears at that and think it sounds interesting, this is an ongoing project that we're working in an EU project called the Network of Excellence in Internet Science. Actually, Cambridge Computer Science is part of this. John Crowcroft, who's here. We have a website where you can register and come to meetings that we're having, take part in email discussions. We're trying there to say, can we take some of the approaches people have developed in complexity science and network science, and to a lesser extent web science, make these more holistic, working across the whole range of disciplines that Cambridge University and many other universities have, to see again if we can produce better internet regulation as a consequence of having this much broader understanding of the different factors that shape people's behaviour online. So you've seen the book. We also have we're working on an article on prosumer law. We have an early version on SSRN if you want to download it. So delighted if you have questions or thoughts here at the mill afterwards if anyone would like to join us, or feel free to contact us online also. Thank you.